Welcome to Learning Aloud, a podcast from the Organizational Dynamics community at the University of Pennsylvania, produced to inspire purposeful leadership practice and transform organizational experience. I am your host, Stephen G. Hart.
So my guest this evening is an affiliated faculty member of the Organizational Dynamics program, Timothy J. Richards. Tim has spent 23 years with the General Electric Company, all in government affairs. At GE, he served as Global Senior Executive for Government Affairs and Policy, Managing Director for Government Affairs and Policy in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey, based in Abu Dhabi, and Managing Director for Energy Policy, based in Washington, D.C. Before joining GE, Tim spent 8 years in the U.S. government with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. He's the co-author of Intellectual Property Rights, Global Conflict, Global Consensus. For the second year, Tim will be teaching an exciting course on the Organizational Dynamics program called Strategic Engagement with Government. This year, the course will be offered on a Wednesday evening and a Saturday morning in June and July. And the first half of this conversation will be just the two of us, and of course, then we'll open up the room for the rest of you. So Tim, tell us what has inspired you to teach the course on strategic engagement with government at Penn.
Well, first of all, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Mindy. Good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy and taking the actions you need to keep yourselves and everybody else in the community healthy. And thank you for spending some time this evening to talk about this subject. It's a particular pleasure to have this opportunity to be with people from the Fels Institute. Last year, Chad Baer's on this call. Last year, Chad was one of a number of Fels students who took part in the first iteration of the course. And that group of Fels students was incredibly engaged, really enthusiastic, and helped make the first run of the class go very, very well. And this year, I've seen a couple of you that I believe are going to be taking the course this summer, starting in just about a little under a month now. And I'm very much looking forward to having that opportunity with you. And what we'll do tonight is we'll touch on a number of the points that are the critical aspects of the class. So that's what this is all about. Now, Steve, in terms of your question, and as you described briefly in my bio, I've spent my whole career working at the intersection between the public sector and the private sector, so to speak, the point where the tectonic plates of government meet the tectonic plates of the private sector. And in the course of that career and working with some great mentors, seeing how other organizations and companies deal with government, both from inside the government and from other roles, including General Electric, and grappling with the issues myself, I've come up with a number of concepts about how I think it should be done, why it should be done, and have also observed that, frankly, many, many organizations just don't think very strategically about government. They treat it almost as an exogenous variable that doesn't matter very much to them, or which they can't affect in any way. And I fundamentally disagree with that. And so the course is really about helping students to understand how they can think about the role of government in their own organizations, whether they're working in an organization, whether they're leading an organization or creating a brand new organization.
Right, so you did your very first run of this course last summer. Of course, there was no pandemic then, but I wonder what your impressions were from the first run and what valuable lessons you've taken away from it that you'll now bring forward to this summer's class, and how will the current pandemic crisis maybe change how you facilitate the course?
Well, Steve, teaching the course last summer was incredible fun. Actually, I found that it was a subject that I was already enthusiastic about, but it was really exciting to see the enthusiasm of the students and to learn from the students about what what worked best, and never having taught it before, frankly, some of the things that needed to be improved. So two aspects of the course that I was really pleased with last summer were, first of all, the conversations with experts. We went and visited people, we brought people into the classroom and spent a lot of time not only having discussed among ourselves certain points, but then talking to somebody who implements that in their daily work. And that went very well and the students were very involved in those conversations. The second thing that worked really well were the simulation role-playing exercises, where the students, we gave case studies, and the students would deal with the questions in the case study, work as a group, and come up with recommendations. That worked really well as well. Frankly, I would say lectures, I didn't intend to do very many lectures, and when I did, it was usually not the best way to communicate. So that was a learning process. I also think one of the things I've done is tried to clarify some of the modules a little bit to make the entire course hang together. And I think that's going to be particularly important this year, doing it as a distance learning exercise. One thing, Steve, that I'm going to miss is the being there aspect of it. You know, we met half the time we met in Pennsylvania, and one half the time we met in Washington, D.C. And in D.C., we were at the Penn Biden Center, and that center has a conference room with big plate glass windows that look out over the Capitol grounds and the Capitol Dome. And then we had the opportunity to go to dinner one night as a group, and we were at a Capitol Hill restaurant sitting there with members of Congress at tables next to us. And there's something about that just was really drove home that we were dealing with something very, very real. So obviously this year we're going to be doing it on Zoom, and it won't be that. But I think we can do a lot of the same things. We're fortunate we're going to have almost every single speaker is coming back. I'm still talking to a couple of them. We'll add some new speakers. And we'll continue to use a lot of breakout sessions where we're doing simulations. And I believe we can do all that very well in a distance learning environment.
So tell us a bit more about your core concepts then.
Well, let's start with the fact that organizations are profoundly affected by government decisions. And Steve, if you could actually show, yes, if you could show that slide, thank you. So in my experience, you could debate how many categories you want to create of ways in which government impacts the private sector. But in my experience, I've found that the four that you see on the slide here really do sum it up very well. And so as you can see, those four categories are government as policymaker, government as regulator, government as a partner to business or to other organizations, and government actually in business, meaning acting in the role of customer or sometimes competitor to the private sector. And we can think about just a few examples. In the class, we actually go into a lot more depth. If we think about healthcare policy, which is at the forefront of, it was at the forefront of the Democratic primaries, and it's at the forefront of many people's minds right now. Think about how fundamental the differences are between where we stand today with healthcare policy and how we implement our healthcare system, and what it would mean if we shifted over to Medicare for all, and what that would mean for the insurance business. It would be really obviously a fundamental impact. Government as regulator. After the financial crisis, banks and financial services companies found themselves with new regulators in the Fed or the Treasury, new capital adequacy requirements, an entirely different mode of doing business brought about not by their own business decision-making, but by regulators. Government as partner. About a year and a half ago, there was the highly visible process of Amazon looking for a second headquarters and seeking the best package that they could get from municipalities and counties and state governments. And then the drama, of course, where Crystal City, Virginia came through with a package that held together and will in fact host the second headquarters. And Long Island City, New York had a package that ultimately didn't command political support. But there's a great example of government as partner. And finally, government in business happens a lot more than most Americans are aware. As Steve said, I lived and worked in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, for General Electric, most of our customers were government owned. So the role of government as customer or competitor can be really significant. And just one fantastic moment from my career was when I was able to be at the Dubai Air Show in 2013, and Emirates Airlines, all by itself, purchased $55 billion of Boeing 777s in one order. And fortunately, there were GE engines on those 777s, so it was important for our company as well. But there you see, again, government directly impacting business results. So the overarching point is that this all really matters, that it's worth thinking about a lot of aspects of ways government can impact any organization. And to use a business analogy, as any organization puts together its strategy, it should be thinking about things like marketing, the role of competitors, what's the competitor strategy, what are customer interests, but also what's the government doing and how can the government affect us either positively or negatively.
So let's use the current pandemic crisis. So what are some specific examples of how the role of government is fundamental to businesses or organizations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that happens in a crisis, and it's almost any crisis, whether it's a war or September 11th or the financial crisis or Japan after the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami, is that government comes to the fore, and the recognition of government and the role of government comes to the fore. And it's happening again, of course, it's happening right now. And, we talk about these as exceptional times. And in fact, one of the ways that these types of times are exceptional is that we all accept that government has a greater role, and we expect that government has a greater role. One of the things that I find is that those organizations that have already been thinking very strategically and carefully about how to interact with government are the ones that are going to be most successful in dealing with government when they suddenly have to. And those who haven't done it just don't have the muscle memory. They don't have the intuition of how the best way is to interact with government at that point. Now, just very briefly, from a policy point of view, one of the things I think organizations can be doing is being part of the solution. And the easiest way to think about that is reopening. As we talk about what's the safe and effective way to get businesses back in business or academic institutions back in an on-campus setting, those who are part of the advisory bodies or who are paying really close attention to the advisory bodies are likely to do better, be more prepared when things do begin to become possible to open up, because their mindset is already there. On the regulatory side, I've got some clients and a lot of my friends who are in the business are busier than ever because there's just so many things happening that are unusual and require speed, whether that's the approval of new therapies or vaccines, or simple things like shipments of key components or key inputs for your products. One of my clients is in the pharmaceutical industry, and they had a shipment of inputs from India that was held up by the Indian government because the Indian government was concerned that they might need that domestically. And so, we had to put a lot of effort into making sure that shipment was released. So we could go on, but you get the sense that there is very much of all aspects of where government impacts the private sector are on steroids right now, are very much in play.
Yeah, so that's very helpful, Tim. So how does an organization take a strategic and maybe coherent approach to all of this then?
Mm-hmm. So I think about it as a 4-part cycle. The four parts are: first, understanding and analyzing the political and policy environment in which the organization is operating. Once you've done that, then the second part is informing business plans to take those government policies and political developments into account, both offensively in terms of opportunities that could be created, and defensively to minimize any negative consequences from those developments. Third, once you have this sense of what the entire universe is and how it affects the company and what you want to do, prioritizing the issues on which you as an organization would like to act. And then acting could be either your own actions internally, or it could be actions that are where you're attempting to influence the decisions of government. And then fourth and finally is to conduct campaigns that are aimed at having an impact on those decisions.
So is this all a form of lobbying then?
Well, Steve, there's an old saying that I imagine many of our viewers have heard, which is something I generally agree with. And the saying is, if you aren't at the table, you're on the menu. And this is a saying that lobbyists use to sell their services to clients, but it's quite real. You can literally, if you're not there, you can literally get cut up and served for lunch. So lobbying is certainly an important part of what an organization needs to do to build the role of government into its business strategy. But I think that saying that strategy for engaging with government is only about lobbying, it's a little bit like saying that basketball is only about shooting the ball. It's true that shooting the ball is very important, and you won't score points if you don't shoot. But any coach who doesn't teach defense, doesn't teach positioning, doesn't teach passing, is going to have a very disappointing result on the court. And the same thing is true with being strategic about the role of government. In fact, the first two steps of that strategic cycle that you see on the screen can often yield very important results all by themselves, without the prioritization, without the lobbying aspect and the campaigns. When I was with GE, once in the early 2000s, GE's energy business was looking at buying a wind turbine manufacturer. At that point, GE didn't have any renewables in the portfolio at all. We didn't make equipment for, or at least not much, in terms of renewable energy. And we recognized that the market for wind power was all created by government policy. So in the United States, there was a production tax credit for wind energy. In the European Union, there were feed-in tariffs, which were guaranteed pricing mechanisms for wind energy. And this was the basis on which the industry existed, and you couldn't sell wind turbines if you didn't have that basis. So GE's decision to get into the industry was based on analyzing and understanding the durability of these policy supports. And it was a lively debate. Some people thought that wind power was kind of a whimsical, not very serious form of energy. And others of us, and I was in fact amongst this group, looked at the political situation and concluded that the wave of support for renewables and for wind was far from temporary. It was in fact something that seemed to be a long-term trend which was likely to continue. And so ultimately the decision was made to make the investment. And it was a great example of a strategic business decision where it was all based on those first couple of parts of the strategic cycle. There was no lobbying because we weren't in the industry. We weren't somebody that was pushing for or against these policy measures, but we could take those into account and make a decision. And I might add, that turned out to be a great investment. Not too many investments turn out that well, but GE spent about $350 million to acquire the business. And by 2018, revenues from that business were $8.7 billion just for the onshore wind power. So $350 million investment turning into $8.7 billion a year in revenues.
That's impressive. But you do think that lobbying is important?
Yes, absolutely. First, I do want to emphasize that lobbying isn't just about policy measures. Lobbying, any government decision can be the subject of a lobbying campaign. And it's important to recognize that most of the principles that we talk about, that we're talking about here this evening and that we'll talk about in the course, can be applied whether the campaign is aimed at selling locomotives to the Egyptian state-owned railway or a campaign to develop a new greenhouse gas reduction policy in the United States.
Right. So why don't you tell us then about a lobbying campaign that wasn't seeking legislation?
One of the most exciting and impactful campaigns I was ever involved in, and certainly one of the most complex, was to help bring electricity back to Iraq. So part of what made it so interesting was that the issues were of fundamental political and humanitarian importance, and political both from a domestic Iraqi point of view and political from an international point of view. So in the immediate aftermath of the conflict in Iraq, GE sent a mission into Iraq to assess the status of the entire electricity network, because a lot of the equipment that had been there was older GE equipment from the pre-Saddam era. And so going into the post-war period, GE actually had a better picture of the Iraqi electricity grid and the status of all the sites, better than the Ministry of Electricity and Water of Iraq, and certainly better than the US government. So when Iraq elected its first post-war government in 2005, the number one issue affecting the political situation in the country was actually electricity. It was a hot summer, and temperatures get around 120 degrees in the summer in Iraq. And the electricity was only on 4 hours a day in Baghdad on a good day, which meant no air conditioning. And this became a major political issue. Ultimately, there were mobs in the streets. People were burning tires and chanting for the removal of the government because of the lack of electricity. And about the same time, General David Petraeus, who was the commander of the US forces in Iraq at that time, flew over the oil fields in a helicopter. And as he flew over the oil fields, there were flaring natural gas from the oil wells. And he was asking his staff, how can it be that there are riots in the street about electricity and the country is flaring off enough natural gas to power the entire country? And that was true. And the answer is complex, but it involved, among other things, the fact that it was hard to capture the gas and there are no gas pipelines to transport it. So General Petraeus actually became as interested as the Prime Minister of Iraq was in getting electricity restored and using the natural gas to do it. About this time, the Iraqi Minister of Electricity and Water went to Washington, came to the United States Energy Association, and in his presentation, he said, listen, I need help. We don't know how to get electricity back to our country. Could you folks please come to us with ideas? So at GE, we knew we could do this. This was big, it was huge, but we knew we could do it. And a number of our competitors also set about putting together proposals. And there were some major challenges. There was no budget. There was actually the entire Iraqi government was operating on the revenues from their oil. There was almost no taxation system. The oil revenues really weren't adequate to fund everything that needed to be funded to rebuild the government. The Iraqi government itself was balkanized with different political parties controlling different ministries. The US government wasn't all that much better. It was somewhat better, but there was a lot of balkanization in the US government and the need to brief all of those people to bring everybody together. The anti-government and anti-US militias and cells were still actively targeting infrastructure for terrorist attacks. And as I mentioned, most of the fuel pipelines were out. So in the face of these challenges, my colleagues in the Middle East and my team in DC and I put together a campaign. And And it was important that we do that because we had to understand the end point, which was what we knew we could actually install. And then we had to work with those who wanted to get there to work through all the obstacles. So we had to address some key concerns. Speed of implementation, the fact that there wasn't any natural gas available, but later there would be, so we had to have units that could operate first on heavy fuel oil and later on natural gas. The need for very careful coordination with the United States government, and a knowledge of the existing facilities and what needed to be added. And so those were the key points that we emphasized. We mapped out everyone that we needed to work with to bring on board. And we began a campaign that involved knowing how to communicate with those folks. We were given advice by our political advisors to help us to make sure we were saying the right thing to the right people. And it was a 2-year campaign. But in the end, Iraq bought 63 gas turbines from General Electric. They were the largest order GE had ever received. It was $2.7 billion of US exports. And most importantly, after a number of bumps in the road, it is now almost the entire power generation capacity of Iraq. If they hadn't done this, they're not in perfect shape by any matter of means. But they would be in much worse shape than they are now. And they're in reasonably good shape in terms of electricity. Yeah. So it's a great campaign and a great thing to have been involved in.
Yeah, it's a great story. And I think that really helps to clarify. What most of your experience is in representing a company in its engagement with government. Do the concepts you've developed also apply to other types of organizations?
Yeah, yes, they definitely do. They don't only apply to business. They apply to governments. They apply to academic institutions. They apply to not-for-profits. In fact, I think of, in many ways, diplomacy is the oldest form of strategic engagement with government. So really, government-to-government engagement is where a lot of these ideas come from. And what I did when I was in the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and what governments do all the time, is try to figure out how to influence what other governments are going to do. Even state governments in the United States are always figuring out how do they influence what the federal government is going to do. So absolutely, there is no question that these ideas can apply not only in business, which is where I developed most of them, but also in government, not-for-profits, and other organizations.
Right. So your experiences within large organizations such as the United States government and the General Electric company, you said earlier that your approach can be applied by any organization, but how exactly may a small or medium-sized organization implement the approach you recommend?
That is an important question, Steve. And I'm convinced that any organization not only should apply the strategic cycle of the ways of thinking about the role of government, but any organization can. And ultimately, it is just the same as the way in which a startup company has to have a strategic plan that thinks about the key things that it's going to do to be successful. You know, that startup might only have a founder and 2 or 3 key executives, but those people grapple with the issues. And what I've seen is that there are those small companies, medium-sized companies, where that group goes ahead and grapples with how does government affect us? And those are the ones who can be most successful. The fact is, you may not have staff putting together briefing books that have all aspects of the questions carefully tabulated and laid out, but you can still have thoughtful brainstorming sessions amongst a small group of people where the same kinds of issues are addressed. And I think that's incredibly important. And part of my perspective on this comes from one of my earliest jobs in Washington back in the 1980s, when I worked with the Semiconductor Industry Association. And the semiconductor industry in the 80s people think of them, these are huge companies like Intel, Advanced Micro Devices, Texas Instruments. But back then, a lot of them were really small. And they didn't have, except in a few cases, they didn't have government affairs executives. It was done by the CEOs. And the CEOs were personally involved. They had a lot of issues. They in particular, they were facing really state-coordinated competition from Japan. And with direct CEO involvement, they put together the Semiconductor Industry Association, and they put together an entire campaign to address the most important issues for them from a public policy and government affairs point of view. And they did it all mainly with CEO direct engagement.
Well, thanks a lot, Tim, for giving us a really great foundation. I'm going to open up now to the audience for their questions and engagement. So just a couple of things, since we are recording this as a podcast, if you could just observe a few of the rules on the screen there. So unmute your mic if you'd like to ask a question, state your name and your affiliation, ask your questions, and then mute again. So let's open it up to the audience. Please go ahead. Alan, I see you're ready.
Hi, thank you. Alan Barstow. I'm the director of Organizational Dynamics, a colleague of Mindy and Steve and Tim. It's been a wonderful opportunity to have Tim come to us. He did not have the advantages of a Fels degree. He has a Fletcher's International degree from Tufts, but we won't hold that against him. He's done a terrific job in bringing this to us. But my question is this, that many of our Fels students might not be focusing so much on international and national level government, but state, municipal, county, some of these things. I certainly think that these things apply, but could you talk a little bit about some of this at the levels of perhaps municipal and state government?
Sure. Well, first of all, the concepts do apply. In fact, in my own experience, we would end up with government issues that could come from any level of government. It could be the a ward of a city that has to issue permits for something, right up to international organizations. So very much a full range of government entities. One of the people we had in the class last summer was actually a Fels student who worked for the Pennsylvania State Department of Agriculture. And I ended up doing some extra work with him at the end because he ended up being called to Harrisburg in the middle of the course to try to work on the farm bill in the middle of the course. And first of all, he was a great student, and he was using some of the things that we were working on in his work in Harrisburg. So, and he told me afterwards that he was going to definitely continue to use a number of the things that we had done in the class. So there's a direct Fels example of exactly that sort of thing.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I was just in a government relations class in Fels with Rob Nixon was a professor. It was a great class, just finished up. He had an article, and I missed the first couple of minutes, so maybe I missed this, that we had to read. One of our readings was about the Obama stimulus plan and the sort of lobbying activity around that, the sort of historic lobbying activity. Obviously, the stimulus for the COVID-19 up to this point, and possibly more coming, is historically, twice the size of that, even more. There's a lot of restraints, with not being able, with social distancing and different things, put on lobbyists and put it on people in government relations right now. I was just curious. Obviously, I would like to hear about this sort of flurry of activity that comes, that has been coming with this stimulus bill, but also the sort of restrictions that have been put on people, or the different challenges that people in government relations have right now, with COVID-19.
Yeah. So, well, but we can certainly agree that when you get these types of stimulus packages, and I don't know if you were there for that part of the discussion, but the degree of attention that gets put onto government affairs multiplies incredibly. And of course, when there's direct money involved, it becomes something that everybody in the entire organization starts to care about. My colleagues who are working in government affairs right now are, if you don't have a good Rolodex, or we don't use Rolodexes anymore, but if your iPhone doesn't have a good list of the telephone numbers of people in government agencies, you've got a real problem. Because I don't know if you've tried calling any government agencies lately, but if you dial the main numbers, you don't get anybody. And so you need to be able to reach people at their homes, on their cell phones. And it's putting a premium on that. I also think that people are spending huge amounts of time figuring out how to go about doing things. Nobody, for instance, the Paycheck Protection Program, it's never been done before. Like, usually, if in a recession, stimulus, there's kind of a known process of how it works. But the Paycheck Protection Program, there was no known process. The banks didn't know how to make that sort of thing work. And so everybody's learning on the fly. And that's another thing, all of my former colleagues are really grappling with. Everything takes 3 or 4 times longer because the process hasn't been tested before. So those are a few things that you can see in the current environment.
Jarrett, I think you would try to jump in with a question. Go ahead, Jarrett.
What was your first position in government relations? And before you took that position, did you know what government relations was about?
Well, I'm still learning about what government relations is about. But because, no, really, every time you do anything, you discover new things. But it was, I mentioned the Semiconductor Industry Association in the 80s. So I'd gotten a master's degree from the Fletcher School, as Alan mentioned. And I was doing some other consulting, but then I was hired into this job working for the Semiconductor Industry Association. That turned out to be a fantastic job. We ended up with a 6-part legislative and policy agenda. And so some of it was lobbying on Capitol Hill, some of it was international negotiations with the Japanese, some of it was directly working with the administration. So it was a really fantastic educational experience. And it was, there was no doubt that I was able to apply a lot of the things that I had learned in graduate school. I could apply. Other stuff, though, like how do you prepare a briefing paper for a meeting with a member of Congress? Not so much. I had to learn that one on the fly. And, I had some great people I was working with who taught me how to do things. But that was my first job doing government relations.
Question. Anybody else with a question? Well, Tim, let me jump in with one. You did mention you have bring speakers to the course, and you still intend to do that, even though it's now going to be a Zoom class. Tell us a bit more about the speakers and what's their context to the class.
Sure. Well, as I said, I try to have speakers that cover all of the major subject areas. So, and many of them are people that I've worked with closely in my career. So we'll have Ambassador Karan Bhatia, for instance. He is now the vice president at Google for government affairs and public policy. And he was a very dynamic speaker. He's had all sorts of roles in government. He was at the Commerce Department, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the Transportation Department, all under the Bush administration. And then he was at GE, where I got to know him, and now he's with Google. And so he's going to come in and talk about the way that Google thinks about how do you be strategic in your engagement with government. How do you decide what campaigns to pursue? We'll have a former colleague of mine who works on things like the Iraq story that I described. He was somebody I worked with in the Iraq campaign. His name is George Picard. He's now responsible for all of government relations for our gas power business. He'll come in to speak. We're going to have a guy named Hani Sabra. Hani runs a consulting firm that does political risk consulting. And he and I worked together closely when I was in the Middle East. So he can talk to us about this idea of being aware of the surroundings you're operating in. And that's what he does. He provides that. We'll talk to the a guy from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Matt Goodman, and he'll talk to us about the role of think tanks. We're going to hear from the Canadian Embassy. The trade minister at the Canadian Embassy will be speaking with our class about some of these aspects. As I said, diplomacy is the oldest form of strategic engagement with government. He'll talk to us about how the Canadian Embassy does that. So we've got a great group, mostly people who have spoken to us before, and then we finish it up with a panel who play the role of a leadership team in a company. And for the final projects, the students present a proposal for a campaign to their leadership team. And so we have guest speakers who are guests who come in to do that as well.
Well, maybe we should ask Chad this question. Tell us a little bit about that final project. Chad, you were there last year, so maybe you should answer that one.
Okay, I've got to think about that. So it was challenging. It definitely it made you think on your feet a little bit. And actually, I like the group component a lot because just those dynamics of the interactions of the different viewpoints on the team kind of reeling each other in if you go off on a tangent and then trying to make it pragmatic before you present to the panel and you're presenting these experts. So you want it to be feasible and realistic. It was a good exercise.
Yeah. Intimidating?
It was, yeah.
Good, that's great. Yeah. Tim, I think somebody from your class last year did something rather meaningful with their project with you. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
You have to give me a little more of a hint of where.
We talked about one of your students who had
capstone.
Capstone.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, actually,
thank you, Alan.
Yes. So, one of my students took off from that meeting we had with Ambassador Karan Bhatia and delved into the questions of Google's government affairs approach, and she did a great job with the piece. Alan actually was the reader for that, so we learned a lot, and she ended up with some really fundamental questions like you've got Google, which is really thinking that they're shaping the environment for their own industry. And then you've got, and that they are not constrained by the way things used to be done. And then you've got this Washington establishment of how things have always been done and the rules and regulations for how to go about doing that. And how does a company like that square those two? How does the company think about their role on public policy, but at the same time move fast and break things? I know that's a Facebook idea, but it's applicable to Google as well. So the fascinating piece of work that she did.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
There she is.
Yeah. Oh, she's there. Very cool. Tell us about it.
Well, sorry, I kind of just jumped in and started listening. Hi, Chad. So yes, the speakers and everyone who was, part of the class, they were amazing. And during one of the sessions with Karan, it really, the things that he talked about, I don't know, afterwards, I remember just going up to Alan and to Tim and saying, this is a really interesting idea for me to think about. And it seemed like a really good capstone idea. And so through Tim, I was able to connect with all these people at Google and talk to them about, how they organize their organization to basically keep Google from to keep their edge. I would recommend this class to anybody just because I feel like you learn a lot. Plus you have a lot of access to people and information that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Well, good for you, Catherine. Well done.
Thanks.
Great. Any other questions?
I'll ask a question.
Mindy. Go ahead, Mindy.
Yeah, so thanks again so much, Tim and Steve, for for being here with us. I'd love to hear any thoughts or advice that you might have for students that are thinking about going into government relations or government affairs, either making a career pivot or, kind of forming initial relationships to get started. What advice or thoughts might you have for them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it helps a lot to have actually worked in government, because so much of what you have to do to be an effective government relations person, you have to understand how government decisions are made, because it all comes down to decisions. And if you understand from having been inside, and it doesn't have to be, any government almost works, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily the one that you're going to be working to try to influence. But I think that experience helps a lot. And it's often really easier to start with a government job and then transition into a private sector job where you're able to apply things you've learned. So that would be one of my main pieces of advice. And then the other is always think about how you add value. So once you are doing government relations, a lot of people, there's a sort of a tendency to think, oh, it's all relationships. But it's not just all relationships. It's actually adding value to the company you work for and making sure that whatever you're doing, it's directly related to a business interest. And the people who do that well, people who can speak government and speak business are the ones who can be successful. So those would be a couple of key points. And if you can speak business to your business people, and that means you know what they care about, and then you can help them achieve what they need to achieve.
Great question, Mindy. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, Tim, let's just go through the logistics again. So when is this course starting?
The course starts on Saturday, the 6th of June, and runs on Saturday mornings and Wednesday evenings in terms of synchronous sessions by Zoom. And that will run most of the way through July.
All right. And of course, we're completely on Zoom this year with no trip to the Biden Center.
Sadly. Trips
yes.
to the Biden Center, no...
and dinners with the congressman and so on.
No dinners outside with the congressman, no.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Tim, for being here tonight and for sharing your insights and your passion for the work that you do and for the teaching that you bring to Penn. We are truly grateful for the course that you have created. I think it's a fascinating and wonderful class. And I talked to some of the students that took it last year, and they thought it was a remarkable experience for them. So thank you for creating it, and then also for being such an open-minded learner and learning from last year and building a whole new version of it for this year in a very challenging environment. We much appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to do this, and I do look forward to seeing a number of you in the Zoom classroom coming up very soon.
And I also like to thank Mindy and Alan Barstow for being here tonight and for helping us to get this going. It's, I think, our third attempt to try to do this. We were scheduled to do it, and then the panic hit, and we had to reset everything. But very much appreciate you all being here. Tim is reachable outside of this session tonight, so you can find him on LinkedIn and a number of other emails. And again, thank you all for being here tonight. I hope you found this session helpful and useful, and all the very best to you in the upcoming semester.